Thank you for joining us. We'll wait about a minute for all the attendees to join the webinar, so please be patient. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Paul Salim, President of the Middle East Institute here in Washington, D.C. Very pleased to welcome you all to today's event, Shifting Dynamics and U.S. Priorities in the Middle East. I'm very pleased to have with us today a top U.S. diplomat and a good friend, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, David Schenker. David, thanks for joining us this morning in D.C.
Thank you.
David was sworn in as Assistant Secretary in June of 2019. Prior to joining the State Department from 2006 to 2019, Mr. Schenker was a fellow think tanker. He was the director of the program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy here in DC. From 2002 to 2006, he served in the office of the Secretary of Defense as the Levant Country Director. In that capacity, he was responsible for advising the Secretary on the military and political affairs of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. He was awarded there the Department of Defense's Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service. That was in 2005. David, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. Thanks for taking the time from your very busy schedule. We have a large audience on Zoom and others following us on YouTube. I know they're all eager to hear your thoughts about U.S. interests, U.S. strategy and policies in the Middle East and North Africa. Just to clarify for our audience, the Near East Bureau at the State Department covers North Africa and the Middle East. It does not include Turkey or Iran or Afghanistan. Interestingly, it also does not include Sudan, which I believe is in the Africa Bureau. In any case, obviously, the Middle East has always been a turbulent and challenging region. And obviously, it's gotten more so with the proliferation of failed states, armed non-state actors, civil wars, regional proxy war, and now great power competition. Over and above that, we now have the health and socioeconomic effects of the COVID-19 crisis. There's so much to discuss from the western part of this region and Libya and Tunisia through Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and so on. David, we look forward to your opening remarks, which is how we'll start, to help us understand how you see the big picture of U.S. interests and U.S. strategy in the Middle East. Then I look forward to a rich Q&A session. This is an on-the-record session, open press. To our YouTube and Zoom participants around the world, I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature. You'll find that on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please put your questions there and not in the chat function. For those calling in by phone or watching on the live stream, you can ask a question on Twitter using the hashtag MEIEvents, or you can email the following email address, events@mei.edu. Please feel free to ask a question at any time. I and the MEI team will be looking for all of your questions and will factor as many as possible into the discussion that I'm having with Mr. Schenker. With that, let's get started. David, the Zoom floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for inviting me today to speak with you. In normal times, MEI's conference is a fantastic event to attend in person. These, however, are not normal times. We have to acknowledge that. And so I'm glad that all of you are taking the time to join virtually today so we can take a moment to discuss the shifting dynamics and U.S. priorities in the Middle East. Today's crisis has changed the way that we do business. And it's forced us to take a hard look at what we're doing in the region. The twin shocks of COVID and the related economic slowdown, including a drastic plunge in oil prices, have laid bare many of the tensions and vulnerabilities lying beneath the surface. How regional governments contend with these challenges and how we position ourselves to work with them will have a significant impact on the region's near-term and, must I say, long-term future. The Secretary has said the United States remains a force for good in the region. In this period of great power competition, the United States remains firmly committed to the Middle East. Now more than ever, it's imperative that we show how we are and then that we will be a force for good. We remain a partner of choice to bring security, stability, and prosperity to the region. It's in our interest to strengthen our partners as we work toward a more stable region. So I'd like to start with the obvious. COVID-19 has upended our regional plans for 2020 dramatically, shifting the regional dynamic. My top priority remains the health and safety of our team, both in Washington and at embassies throughout the region. We have adjusted our work to accommodate social distancing measures, obviously, that are needed to slow down the spread of the virus. However, the challenges in the region persist, and in many ways, the core of our work remains the same, even if we're doing it with social distance. We're as active as ever through virtual engagements like today, and with regular calls with our counterparts. At the outset of this crisis, we worked with our partners across the region to repatriate thousands of Americans, and we thank countries who generously offered us support as we've addressed the virus here at home. More concerning is that the virus and its economic impacts in particular have shown a spotlight on the challenges facing governments in the region. Some countries have done a remarkable job containing the virus, taking quick action and building the trust of their people, but we remain concerned about rising cases in other countries. For example, in Iraq, where the twin crises of COVID-19 and low oil prices threaten economic peril, and the new government will face much tougher choices than it would have before the pandemic. Gulf countries are seeing a dramatic rise in their cases among expatriate labor force, potentially altering a long-standing labor patterns. Major infrastructure projects and investment are on hold, and some less wealthy countries are considering major asset sales in an effort to weather the economic crisis. And we're deeply concerned about the spread of the virus throughout conflict zones and vulnerable refugee and displaced populations. The bottom line is this: the COVID-19 crisis has put tremendous pressure on governments already facing difficulties, be they political or economic, and removed the margin for error that used to allow governments to skate by with half measures. Those who build trust with their people take the necessary steps to protect public health and articulate clear, inclusive, and scientifically sound strategy to combat the virus effectively will emerge stronger. And those who do not will face tremendous difficulty with the regional and international safety net upon which they once relied for survival. Before diving into specific regional issues, I'd like for a moment to acknowledge the global context that the U.S. engagement in the Middle East must now address. It's an era of great power competition. We're increasingly concerned about efforts by Russia and the People's Republic of China to expand their influence in the region in ways that undermine regional stability and the international order. COVID-19 has also highlighted the stakes for great power competition. The PRC is very active in publicizing its COVID-19 response, assistance in every NEA country, taking full advantage of even the smallest delivery or purchased equipment to portray itself as a leader in health response. However, we're concerned about disinformation and misrepresentation by the Chinese government. The PRC is engaged in an aggressive information campaign to reshape the global narrative around COVID. So the world sees China as a global leader in response to this crisis rather than a source of the pandemic. We're not forcing countries to choose between the United States and the PRC. Countries can and should maintain healthy relationships with both, but we want to highlight the cost that comes with certain PRC engagements. PRC seeks to undermine the rules-based international order that has provided peace and security and protected human rights for decades. In particular, we're concerned with PRC investment in critical infrastructure that can compromise a country's security. We've spoken with so many of our partners about taking a careful look at investment, major contracts, and infrastructure projects. We want to ensure that PRC's influence and activities in the region do not come at the expense of the region's prosperity, stability, fiscal viability, and longstanding relationship with us, the United States. Turning to Iran, our top regional priority remains ending Iran's malign regional influence. Since withdrawing from the JCPOA 2 years ago, we have applied far-reaching economic pressure on Iran and enhanced our deterrence in the region. As a result, Iran's leaders are selling off state assets intended for the Iranian people to help keep their corrupt practices and destabilizing foreign policy afloat. Our maximum pressure campaign will continue until Iran begins to behave like a normal nation. We remain concerned about Iran's continued support for proxy groups that have the potential to put American lives at risk. We continue to closely monitor all developments in Iran's nuclear program. Iran must be denied all paths to a nuclear weapon. Iran's continued expansion of nuclear activities is unacceptable, and we will continue imposing maximum pressure on the regime until it reverses course. The U.S. has offered and continues to offer humanitarian assistance to the Iranian people to help address the coronavirus outbreak. It's unfortunate for the Iranian people that the government has rejected this offer. Our priority has been to stand with the Iranian people, and this offer remains on the table. We are willing to talk with Iran. Indeed, our policy has always been to sign a better deal with the Iranians, but they need to make the decision to take the necessary step to come to the table. Given the high importance we place on deterring Iran, we've made it a priority to strengthen our relationship with our Gulf partners and address the ongoing conflict in Yemen. On Tuesday, I took part in the Saudi UN Virtual Donors Conference for Yemen to reinforce that message. As the conflict in Yemen continues, it brings tremendous suffering for the Yemeni people. We call on the Houthis to de-escalate, increase humanitarian access, and put their support behind Special Envoy Griffith's efforts to achieve a political settlement in the conflict. We also call upon the Houthis to stop obstructing humanitarian assistance to the Yemeni people. We've made the difficult decision to halt much of our assistance to areas controlled by the Houthis because they were not observing internationally recognized humanitarian principles to allow the aid to get to people in need. With COVID poised to spread throughout the region, the Houthis' refusal to allow aid agencies access will have tragic consequences for the Yemeni people. Over the past year, we've taken multiple steps in conjunction with our Gulf partners to beef up strategic cooperation and reinforce deterrence. We continue to urge Gulf countries to repair the rift. Greater unity among our Gulf partners would help the region addressing common threats and challenges. However, falling oil prices and decreased worldwide demand due to the COVID pandemic means the major oil producing states will need to cut capital expenditures or put on hold major projects. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and others, which have been major donors to everything from post-ISIS reconstruction to humanitarian assistance in Yemen, no longer have the same capacity to support their neighbors. Nevertheless, we encourage all to continue to support critical assistance goals. In Iraq, we look forward to working with the new Prime Minister, Khatami. His confirmation is an important step forward for Iraq. Between COVID, the decline of oil prices, he's got a lot on his plate, but we're confident he will be able to put the interests of his country and people first to address the political, economic, and security challenges in Iraq. To reset and renew our relationship in Iraq, we'll be renewing our strategic dialogue next week, virtually, of course. We hope to follow up with an in-person meeting sometime in July or August when travel and meetings will be permitted. The strategic dialogue allows us, or will allow us, in the right setting to confront Iraqi leaders with a stark choice. If they choose to act like a sovereign state, an international partner committed to working with us against ISIS, then a readjusted bilateral relationship will continue to bring great advantages to Iraq. If they don't make that choice, we won't be able to sustain our commitment and presence. The dialogue will need to work through some tough issues. Iraqis need to decide what kind of relationship they'll want to have with the United States. We want to be a partner with Iraq, not only in security, but politically and economically as well. But that partnership requires Iraq requires that Iraq exercises sovereignty, particularly when it comes to external forces and proxies threatening the safety of US and coalition forces and diplomatic personnel. Without adequate security, we simply cannot move forward with other aspects of our relationship. And without our security umbrella, our international partners are also likely to leave. We hope to reach consensus on fundamental principles of sustainable bilateral partnership, and we'll see how far this government is prepared to go to repair our strategic relationship. And we'll make every effort to support and invest in Khatami and help his government succeed. That's why we announced the 120-day extension for the electricity waiver and why we're pausing on additional sanctions designations. Earlier today, the Secretary hosted a de-ISIS coalition small ministerial group to mark the next step in our partnership to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS and the stabilization of liberated territory and communities. The success of the global coalition is one of our most important accomplishments in the region in recent years. The 82 members of the coalition, 77 nations and 5 international organizations, successfully liberated all the territory ISIS once occupied. We continue to provide assistance to our partners in Iraq and Syria to guard against the resurgence of ISIS, and this includes $20 billion in stabilization assistance, support for removal of explosive ordnance and remnants of the war, and assistance to address humanitarian needs. ISIS remains a formidable enemy, but relentless pressure by our security partners in Iraq and Syria with coalition support is ensuring ISIS and its affiliates are unable to reconstitute any territorial enclave. Our policy objectives in Syria have been consistent. We are committed to the enduring defeat of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, an irreversible political solution in Syria conflict in line with UNSCR 2254, and the removal of all Iranian-backed forces from Syria. We're working closely with our international partners and with UN Special Envoy Peterson to advance the political process in support of that resolution. In Libya, we'd like to see the GNA and the LNA return to the 5+5 military commission talks facilitated by the UN, complete a draft ceasefire agreement, and we're hopeful that talks might begin as early as this week. While the US is supporting the UN and advocating for it to be structured to be as effective as possible, Russia is deploying advanced fighter planes to Libya. External backers need to stop fueling the conflict, respect the arms embargo, and let the Libyans agree on a peaceful political solution. Finally, I'd like to address Israel. Last month, the Secretary and I traveled to Israel and spoke with the incoming government about Iran, China, and other topics. My meetings didn't involve any discussions of annexation, but the Secretary did address it when he spoke to the press. I know that topic is on many of your minds. We continue to pursue the path of peace that the President set out in January, presenting the vision for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. We understand that the Palestinians don't like parts of this plan, which is why we've asked them to present alternative ideas and agree to negotiate with Israel, and for that matter, to start talking again to us at senior levels. We've heard the messages from key regional and European partners. We encourage our partners to urge the Palestinians to bring their concerns to the negotiating table. In our view, the US vision for peace is a realistic framework to inform those negotiations. As I noted at the beginning of my remarks, these are not normal times. Regional dynamics are shifting rapidly. Nevertheless, you have seen throughout my remarks, I think, that our priorities remain relatively consistent. The way that we are doing our work has changed dramatically. We are still learning the craft of virtual diplomacy. We're still pursuing the same goals, though, as we were before January, to demonstrate the United States remains a force for good throughout the region and a partner of choice to ensure regional stability, security, and prosperity. I know that time was short here. We tried to cover a lot of ground. There's some things that I left out, but I thank you for your time and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Assistant Secretary. An excellent sort of expose of where you see things standing in terms of U.S. interests and policy. And I'm keeping an eye on our guest questions. I'll try to integrate as many of them as I can. But let me begin sort of with a big picture, a couple of questions, David. You did mention great power competition. It's obviously sort of a recently resurgent concern. It's pivotal to the U.S. national defense strategy. Uh, uh, so I'd like to ask you a little bit if you could flesh out, because we're also asked the same thing. What is it, for example, about China's presence in the region that is okay, and what about it is worrisome? Obviously, China is heavily in Iraqi oil and gas, is a big trading partner, is a big consumer, but it also has a military base in the Red Sea. It leased a port in Israel, which I know was a concern. How would you flesh out a bit what is concerning or what is less concerning about China? The same a little bit about Russia. I mean, both the Obama administration and the Trump administration, partly seem to be okay with the Russian military presence in Syria, and yet great power competition is really still a very high priority. And when we see sort of US decision making in the region, understandably, we see the concern about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is really not a great power issue, concern about Iran, concern for Israel. So if you could flesh out a bit what great power competition means in detail. And the second big picture question is, since I would say the Obama administration or the end of the George W. Bush administration, up till this administration, there's been sort of a sense that obviously the U.S. is not leaving the Middle East, but it's reducing its engagement, reducing its presence. Partly it was a pivot to Asia, partly it was fatigue. Now we also have an oil market where the U.S. doesn't really feel it desperately needs oil from the region. This is a big concern in the region. You say that it's a long-term partner. The U.S. is staying. What can you say about the relative decline in the sort of intense presence in the Middle East? And one has to say that the COVID crisis in the U.S. Is creating a U.S. public that is going to be obsessed with domestic affairs and not very eager about adventures abroad. So how would you comment on the big picture?
There's a lot of questions here, Paul.
Sorry about that.
Let me start off with China. Really, the way that China has handled the COVID highlights, I think, to all of us, certainly to the administration, but I think should highlight to all of us and our regional partners, just how problematic their behavior has been. The lack of transparency, the lack of provision of access to WHO, to Wuhan, the delays in provision of information, even the provision of the strain of the initial virus, steps that they took to cover up the absence of transparency and manipulation of international organizations and the rules-based system, I think contributed to really the crisis that we are in today. Likewise, I think when you make a deal with China, right? Not all deals, but certainly when you make deals with China, there are certain hallmarks of those deals, whether they are leveraging them for political decisions in these countries. Also, that we have to recognize, and what we've been telling our partners in the region, is that when you make a deal with China, you are essentially, there is no private industry there, right? You are essentially, everything that you do is the property of the Chinese Communist Party. So if you make a deal with Huawei, you are basically all the information and your data that is going over the Huawei lines is property of the Chinese Communist Party. When you take a COVID kit from a Chinese genetics company, your DNA is property of the Chinese Communist Party, and all the implications that go with that. So we're talking with our allies. China is engaged in this face mask diplomacy, right? An effort to repair its tarnished reputation that flowed from the lack of transparency in how they dealt with the COVID. So they deliver a face mask here, some PPE there. They're trying to make basically some procurement into that it is actually a donation when it's not. They provided, I think, 2 airport thermometers to Lebanon. I got great press on this, when the rest of us know that the airport has been closed for a few months. Likewise, the way they handle the trade, hallmark is the predatory loan, which in the case of places like Djibouti resulted in when the terms of the loan couldn't be renegotiated or paid off, then you end up giving out a 99-year lease on a port. There are other debt traps that Middle Eastern states are engaged in. I don't want to get into the specifics of it, but it's incredibly damaging. So we have been talking to our allies about this and the need for these states that want to do business with China to do their due diligence before they do so, to do a proper review. In our case, we have CFIUS, we have FIRMA, we have the Export Control Act. We look at these to see how they impact our national security, and states that have strategic partnerships with us in the region have to look at these not only for their own national interests and strategic interests, but also how it impacts their relationship with us and our ability to maintain these strategic relationships. So that's on one side. I think, in terms of Russia in the region, I think, for better or for worse, I think the Obama administration had welcomed in the Russians to Syria, assuming that this was going to be a quagmire. And with 45th wing aircraft, the Russians changed the course of the war, and the Assad regime remains here today. I think it was a blunder, frankly, because in addition to helping perpetrate what to me resembles a genocide, the killing of some 500,000 mostly Sunni civilians, it also has provided Russia with a base in the region and has emboldened them to take further steps in the region, like we're seeing right now in Libya. This is quite a pernicious role. I think a lot of our regional partners recognize this, but they are not playing a productive or stabilizing role in the region, whether in Syria or, for that matter, in Libya. And so this is not a competition. It is, looking at what for 45 years was the bedrock of U.S. policy, which was to keep the Russians out of the Middle East. Now that they're in, they're playing a destructive role, and we think, frankly, that they should get out. So that's on the great power competition. We are not, as I said, forcing states to choose, but we want them to be aware as they are making these choices what the implications of those choices are. I don't want to get into your second question about our presence in the region. We are engaged diplomatically, economically, and still militarily. But as you're aware, Paul, we have an NDS, a National Defense Strategy, that highlights China and Russia as strategic competitors. So we have to balance what are, I think, very compelling reasons to be in the Middle East and our commitments to our allies with these other threats to U.S. national security. But I'll leave the force posture issue to DOD to discuss, but those are just some preliminary thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you, David. I know Iran is not technically in your on the Near East Bureau, but it affects much of what you do, obviously. President Trump just announced about an hour ago the release of a U.S. Navy veteran, Michael White. My question relates to how you see U.S.-Iranian tensions, relations at this moment, and how it affects the countries you're dealing with. In 2019, we certainly saw a massive, pattern of escalation from the Iranian side in response to U.S. economic sanctions, attacks on Gulf shipping, and then attacks on Abqaiq and the Saudi facilities, attacks on U.S. presence in Iraq. 2019 ended, or 2020 began, with the U.S. escalation, as it were, and the killing of General Soleimani. In most of 2020, however, it seems that we're in a moment of, is it detente, is it de-escalation, is it holding a breath before the election? We see, some cooperation, or at least accommodation, in the selection of the new Iraqi prime minister. We don't see any escalation of attacks in Iraq. Situation in Lebanon is tense, but no direct escalation there. In Yemen, some signs of de-escalation. and we have, what seems to be a prisoner swap. What can you say, are there any back channel talks? How did this release come about? Is it meaningful? Is there any minimal level of, cooperation, or that's too strong a word, accommodation between the US and Iran and in Iraq or Afghanistan or Lebanon or Yemen?
Well, thanks, Paul. So actually, Iran is in my portfolio. It's in the MEA Bureau. We have a special envoy, Brian Hook, who deals with these matters on a daily basis. So you asked how it impacts the countries I'm dealing with. When I started, I mean, you highlighted all these things, but when I started at State, we had immediately Fujira, the scuttling of boats, the hijacking of boats, bringing them to Iranian ports. We had the shooting down of a U.S. UAV over international waters. We've had attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq, coalition forces, U.S. forces in Iraq, sort of a dramatic escalation from the Iranians. The administration, I think, had a lot of forbearance, not looking for a fight with the Iranians. But the policy was in place where the Secretary of the President had made clear, I think it's September 11th, 2019, the Secretary said very publicly, we are going to hold Iran responsible for the actions of its proxies. And so in response to the storming of the embassy by Iranian proxies and then the killing of an American, we killed Soleimani. I think what you have right now is an environment where the threat from Iran in targeting Americans, whether uniformed or diplomatic, persists. I don't think there is a standing down or a détente. I think the Iranians, because of the financial pressures, I think the domestic pressures, COVID in particular, it's slowed down some of the activities. And perhaps they are playing a waiting game, waiting for elections here. I don't profess to know what the Iranian calculation is, but from where we sit, the threat has not gone away. It persists and it's severe.
Thank you, David. Yeah, my mistake. Turkey and Afghanistan are not in the nearest bureau, but Iran is. Sorry about that. I have a lot of questions on Israel-Palestine, and that put them in two categories: Israel and sort of then Palestine, although of course they're related. Obviously, you said you were just there with Secretary Pompeo. The issue of annexation of settlements on the West Bank is a very high concern issue throughout the region, obviously for Palestine, Jordan, and the Arab countries. And the administration, it's not, maybe is sending mixed, it's hard to tell exactly where the U.S. stands on this, and I wanted clarification. If Israel moves ahead with annexation, what will the U.S. Position be? Is the U.S. prepared to recognize Israeli annexation or not? What is the purpose of the joint U.S.-Israel annexation technical group? So some clarity on the annexation question. On the U.S.-Palestinian relations, which have really broken off since the early days of the Trump administration, in terms of talks with the PA or the leadership there, also in terms of support for UNRWA. I have a number of questions. There's been some talk of some kind of U.S.-Palestinian re-engagement, maybe under third-party auspices. Is that the case? Would the U.S. consider some official re-engagement with the Palestinians? You did mention that a bit in your opening remarks, but maybe in the context of the risk of annexation, there might be some potential there. And is there, in terms of UNRWA and the additional pressure that COVID is creating for Palestinian refugees, among others, is there any reconsideration of the UNRWA funding question?
Thanks, Paul. So as you know, the vision for peace, and the president has said this after the report was, the vision was released, the report designates areas that will be the future Palestinian state, and the president has said that areas that are not included in that, that they can be, Israel can extend its sovereignty over. I think he said that from the podium the night that the proposal or the vision was released. With that said, I can tell you that that we continue to discuss this with the Israelis. I understand that the White House is in close touch with both Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition partners. There are a number of decisions that the government of Israel has to make to include what it intends to pursue, what timeline. We're seeing a lot of discussion of that right now. I understand that those discussions are taking place right now inside the Israeli government. They're going to have to find their way forward collectively. As you know, this is a coalition government with, as they would say in Lebanon, a house of many mansions. So the work of, as you said, you called it the annexation committee. It's actually called the U.S.-Israel Mapping Committee, where they're looking at maps more closely on the ground. And I don't want to prejudice the outcome of either the mapping committee or the Israel government's internal discussions. But as I said, it is our hope that the Palestinian leadership will take a hard look at this and understand that a seat at the table where they can have an impact over the direction, where they can engage with the vision for peace, I think is a lot more productive than sitting on the sidelines and ending security cooperation, something that is neither in the Palestinians' interests nor in the Israelis' interests. Security is important to everyone, and this doesn't strike us as being particularly productive, and we should hope that they would resume that. We understand as well, as I said earlier, that that the Israelis, have a number of decisions to make. We've heard from our Arab partners, from the EU, of their concerns. These apparently were taken into account when the vision was drafted, but we continue to talk with our partners about this, and the Israelis are weighing it themselves. As for COVID, as you know, I believe it was about a month ago, we gave $5 million, and I am confident that if there's a Palestinian requirement, that we would entertain that. Not UNRWA, but it's hard to tell whether the PA in the West Bank has a requirement. They just rejected tens of millions of dollars of aid from the UAE, which had arrived in to be delivered to the West Bank.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, David. Let me ask a few questions coming in from the audience about Syria. The Caesar Act, I think, is due to come into effect in about a couple of weeks. How will that affect, how will the U.S. deal if some partner countries, whether in Europe or elsewhere, deal with Syria? Is the U.S. government prepared to impose sanctions on allies? Obviously, countries in the region, maybe Iraq, Lebanon, possibly Jordan, who have borders. So what are the, in a sense, repercussions of the Caesar Act for third parties? Second question coming in on Syria is relating to the sort of benchmarks for long-term or short-term U.S. presence in Syria. Obviously, with Iraq, it's dealing with the sovereign, legitimate government, and it, with strategic dialogue going on there. The U.S. is being present in northeastern Syria because of ISIS. Much of the ISIS resurgence is happening actually in regime-controlled areas. So, what is currently sort of the, either call it exit strategy or the plan for Syria? And what would the benchmarks be? When would it be the case that the U.S. can say they are able to leave. How much, also questions from the audience, is that related to our Kurdish partners there, the PYD or the YPG, their integration of Arab groups, their talks or not talks with the Assad regime? So if you can unpack a little bit where you see the US in Syria.
Thanks, Paul. Listen, we continue to be narrowly focused on the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. That is a political process and transition. Until then, until the Assad regime embraces this, I don't see any normalization, nor do I see any reconstruction. And we are engaged with our allies on this. This is a pariah regime, deserves to be treated as such. We will continue to pursue that policy. And I imagine there could be repercussions on partners that move to either rehabilitate or renovate Syria. I don't want to prejudice what those are, but we continue our counter-ISIS mission in the east of Syria. We continue every day to work with our Kurdish partners, which are integrating more and more. I guess I don't know what the metric is. We can talk to Jim Jeffrey here, but I believe that the metric is the enduring defeat of ISIS.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions about Lebanon, a lot of Lebanese on the line as well. Obviously, a lot going on there. You know Lebanon very well. If you could sort of maybe do two things. One, lay out what you see as U.S. interests, U.S. stake in Lebanon. Why does the U.S. care about Lebanon, and how? What are U.S. kind of benchmarks, red lines, goals in Lebanon? And then the flip side of that, obviously, the Lebanese government, which was born amidst a lot of political unrest, has limited legitimacy, but is reaching out to the IMF and obviously indirectly U.S. influence and others for assistance. And I know the general position, but if you could give a bit more detail and nuance to sort of U.S. interests there and how those interests you see being realized or pursued in some common way with the Lebanese themselves.
Well, this is a long-standing relationship with Lebanon. It's an enormous Lebanese expatriate population in the United States. In 2005, 2009, Lebanon elected pro-West parliaments. These were not able to carry out their own agenda, obviously, given the threat posed by Hezbollah on the ground. But it's a state with which we share a love of life and common values with an enormous portion of the population. So we have long-standing interests there. We have a counterterrorism partnership, fighting Sunni Islamic extremists with the LAF. They are a great partner, and CENTCOM considers them one of our best military partners in the region. Deep interests with Lebanon. It is also obviously a country that Iran has great interest in. So we have an interest in a regional democracy, a flawed democracy, but a democracy succeeding and not becoming a vassal state of Iran. Listen, I think that there are really interesting developments going on the ground. We'll start off with the IMF. You have the government, which Hezbollah is a leading coalition partner. This government has indicated that it is interested in an IMF program. It is engaged in a dialogue with IMF. They are not anywhere close to negotiations yet for a program. I imagine this will take some time, but our view is that the government of Lebanon not only has to talk about reform, but more than 100 days in, to have a sort of a plan that has some specificity, but not insufficient, that they demonstrate that they are willing to take tough decisions to reform various sectors, public sector as well, to fight corruption, to be a more transparent state, to change the way they do business, to generate revenues, collect duties, etc. All these are important and something that we think is sine qua non for getting an IMF program. And that's demonstrating that commitment, going out and implementing these reforms. They're hard to do politically, certainly with the current economic crisis. One that was certainly on its way because of years of sort of financial practices that are, at the least to say, unorthodox, but exacerbated by the war next door in Syria, to be sure. But this was something that was going to happen anyway. So tough decisions have to be made. It seems to me that Hezbollah is not known as being a reform-minded organization. They benefit greatly from illicit finance, from corruption, from not paying ports duties. And so it's hard to see how they're going to get behind this reform. So we are, standing, we are talking to the IMF, we are talking to the government of Lebanon, and we are closely observing the direction, the trajectory of this. Meanwhile, on the ground, we have a big protest planned for this weekend. We saw protests in October, November, that sort of petered out in the winter, but are coming back now, also with COVID, that are coming back now. And this weekend, these demonstrations focus not only on the need for reform, but also a demand that Hezbollah end its practice of having illegal weapons outside the control of the central government. That I think we're seeing some element of dissatisfaction with the way the sort of heavy-handed nature of Hezbollah and the dominance of society, and how this is undermining a potential for reform and economic repair of Lebanon. And so we're seeing a backlash, and we're keeping an eye on this as well. We obviously are concerned, as in the past, that Hezbollah will perpetrate violence to try and undermine these peaceful demonstrations. But these Lebanese people should be allowed to exercise their rights and demonstrate peacefully.
Thank you. Also, a quick follow-up on Lebanon from the audience. It's about sanctions.
Yes.
A lot of discussion about whether through the Magnitsky Act or now through the Caesar Act. Obviously, Hezbollah has been under sanctions for a long time, or at least elements of it. But there are other, political allies and others in Lebanon. And it really is maybe a two-part question. One is the uprising in Lebanon was, rising up against general corruption and the corruption of the ruling class, and the issue of, funds that could have been siphoned off and put in, secret bank accounts here and there, which is a form of corruption, sort of technically unrelated to the whole Hezbollah-Iran issue or even the Syria issue per se. So there's that type of sanctions. And then there is the, anti-Iran or anti-Syrian regime and the Caesar Act. Do you see anything changing in the U.S. sanctions, approach to Lebanon and different Lebanese or Lebanese groups?
Well, listen, first of all, I want to say that, there are some, like Hezbollah, who are seeking to blame the United States for Lebanon's financial woes. You'll remember that there have been, two banks that have been designated, but even weeks before the Jamal Trust Bank was designated, Lebanon's ratings went from a B- to a triple C. I believe that was Moody's, but I could be wrong on that. This is a trajectory that is unimpacted by U.S. sanctions. And in fact, it's my belief that U.S. sanctions in trying to clean up Lebanon's banking system, opaque banking system, will actually, in the long run, bring confidence to the system. That will bring more investment and more people using the Lebanon's banking system. But I'm not going to prejudice particular sanctions against individuals, but there are Magnitsky sanctions out there. There are Caesar Act sanctions, and there are sanctions related to those who aid and abet a U.S. designated foreign terrorist organization, Hezbollah. It has taken a long time to target these allies, but they are coming. COVID sort of slowed things down, but yes, it is our intention to move ahead with these.
Thank you, David. Let me turn to some questions coming in on Yemen. Obviously, a major humanitarian crisis from well before the COVID crisis. And you talked about certainly the humanitarian aspect. In the last year or two of the Obama administration, Secretary Kerry was very active in trying to, find a way forward, a way out for Yemen. Do you foresee any sort of activism on the U.S. diplomatic side in the second half of 2020, maybe with regional partners from the GCC and others, to re-engage, at least to try to find a more permanent de-escalation or hopefully settlement in Yemen? Or do you see this as something that is really going to have to be left for other, for later?
No, I mean, I think that the term, re-engagement is just not accurate. I think we have always been engaged on this. Certainly for the year that I've been at the State Department, give or take, it's something that we're engaged in around the clock. I've got Chris Hensel, who's at the YAO, the Yemen External Office based in Riyadh, who's met with all the players, and I do mean all the players. I'm talking to my counterparts about this with some frequency, not only in the region but with the French, British, and of course with Martin Griffiths. We talk to some frequency. We are supportive and appreciative, actually, of the Saudis' flexibility on this. We really think they are now playing a productive role on Yemen. How so? Well, one was the 1 week unilateral ceasefire they declared, and then a 1 month unilateral ceasefire, which was, I think, very productive. They have the Riyadh Agreement, where they are trying to bring the STC and the Republic of Yemen government under Hadi back together to get them to come to some sort of political agreement about representation within the government. And because if you want to make headway on negotiations with the Houthis about what their future role will be, it's important to have a unified Yemeni government also sitting at the table. And on that front, the Saudis have been dealing directly in a very productive and, I think, in good faith, with the Houthis, being flexible and in their negotiations. But what we haven't seen to the same degree, by any stretch of the imagination, is the Houthis negotiating with this kind of good faith. So we are engaged, and we will continue to be engaged. And I imagine, even more so, because Yemen, like Libya, the health systems are just not capable of dealing with the crisis they're facing, and we are very concerned about a bad outcome with not only on the humanitarian front but exacerbated by COVID.
Thank you. I mean, you did mention Libya, obviously, in your opening remarks, and we can certainly talk more about that. But I wanted to bring in sort of the North Maghreb states, which are not often sort of discussed as much as other crisis areas. And I want to get your take on sort of U.S. perception of interest, strategy, and policy with the Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Maghreb states. How high in U.S. sort of regional interests is it, and what are your main sort of priorities there?
Thanks. Because I don't have the figures in front of me. I believe we, for COVID response, we've given some 25 million to Tunisia. I don't have the exact figure on Morocco. No, we are interested. We are also, very interested in engaging, and probably I would have actually been in Algeria about a month and a half ago had there not been COVID. This is a country with a new government that appears to be taking a slightly different attitude about business. Has got an enormous amount of resources, both in terms of oil and in a young, well-educated population. I think it's got a tremendous promise. So this is also a country of interest. We understand that Morocco has to date done fairly well with the COVID. We had to cancel a few military exercises with them because of the COVID, but no, I think, listen, the stability of these North tier countries in the Maghreb is critical to US interests and to the interests of our European friends, right? This is not only an issue of migration, right? It's an issue of terrorism, counterterrorism, and prosperity, trying to generate some prosperity in these countries. So but in many ways, in some of these countries, I mean, Tunisia still faces many of the economic challenges it did back in 2011 when Mohamed Bouazizi self-immolated. So, these are countries that we very much want to succeed and are taking steps to do so.
Thanks, David. Maybe the last question, given the time, is on U.S. relations with the Gulf countries of the GCC. And it's a three-part question. One is the GCC remains divided. And are there any new efforts? We've seen some reports. Maybe there's some efforts for the U.S. and others to try to fix that internal split. Any news there? Secondly, the relationship was built 75 years ago on oil and oil interests, but in the current energy climate, both the capacity of the U.S. to produce much of its own oil, collapse in oil prices, which might be long-term, is that relationship as solid as it was in the energy sector? Third is the security question. Many countries in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, I would say, felt quite vulnerable when Iran attacked Abqaiq, and there wasn't immediately any major sort of military defense, response, as it were. So my question is, how do you assess U.S. efforts with the GCC, U.S. Gulf relations? Where does it stand?
Thanks. Well, I think we're in pretty good shape in the Gulf. I think we have burgeoning trade with countries like Qatar that are increasing at like 50% a year. I mean, remarkable developments, very dynamic trade relationships that are increasing, throughout the region. We have been focused and working on trying to patch up the Gulf rift. We believe it is a distraction. It takes focus away from our common threats and coordinating on different types of policies. We're working on trying to open the airspace for Qatar throughout the region. We do not think it is either for Qatar to be paying airspace fees to Iran or for Qatari airlines necessarily to be flying over Iranian airspace, which we know, after the shooting down of a civilian airliner in January, is not the safest thing to do. So we're working on this. We are engaged. There are some positive developments on this front, and this is something that Secretary is engaged in, I'm engaged in, and that we are talking with all our partners, both in the Gulf and with Egypt about. So it's hard to be optimistic about solving something. I think that it's the 3-year anniversary on June 5th of the rift. So it's hard to be very positive and optimistic. But I think that we've got the parties talking, and in a way that is productive. There's still a lot of work to do, but I'm hopeful that we'll get there. On energy, we had a hiccup a few months back. You might recall when the Saudis, were, I think it was described as dumping oil, and an effort, I think, to get the Russians to start to abide by their commitments. But to be sure, the United States was collateral damage there, and that it's not only the lower prices or price volatility that was not helpful, but we employ something like 1 million people in the fracking and energy industry here in the United States. So this was something that was a bit of a hiccup. We worked with our Saudi friends and others, and came up with a solution. I am hopeful that this will not happen again. It's very difficult, I think, at times to keep OPEC on message and on board. There are a lot of states, and this is nothing that's new, Paul, but there are a lot of states who are facing real economic duress right now. And so I think that it wouldn't be a surprise to see some states cheating or things that really annoyed one partner or the other in OPEC. And so, but I hope we've passed the worst on this. Finally, on Abkhazia, people, I think a lot was missed here about the significance of Abkhazia. It's not only that this was, one of the first times that Iran had directly targeted with missile technology or UAVs Saudi Arabia, a member of good standing at the United Nations. They've done this before. One of the proxies fired off an armed one-way UAV from Iraq, targeting Saudi Arabia. But I think people are looking for enormous military response to this. The fact was that Saudi was able to fill the gap very quickly, that there was no interruption of oil hitting the markets. So while this was incredibly offensive and problematic attack, Saudi was able to get this thing back up and running, which is a success story in 3 weeks, right? And to fill the gap with reserves along the way. We are in constant contact with our Gulf partners about forced posture. There's a lot that is read into anytime we take an asset out of the region, when we're going to put it back, what else is going to backfill it. I think a lot is being read into that. That is, not correct. We still have an enormous number of troops in the region. We have people at sea, and that we have assets that can reach the region in a relatively short time. We remain tight partners with our Gulf friends and coordinate with them on what we're doing. So I think relations are good, and are solid, and have a real basis to position us for close and continuing relationship in the future as the partner of choice.
Assistant Secretary of State David Schenker, great to see you, and thanks for taking the time to be with us. We are out of time. I know there's dozens of other questions that the audience and others would like to engage with you on, but for this session, I really want to thank you and your team very much. Thank the MEI team as well, and thank everybody who joined us on Zoom and who followed this on YouTube and through our live stream. David, I wish you luck in the months ahead, and to everybody, stay well and stay safe, and see you in another webinar.
Thanks so much, Paul.